college campuses. The idea here is that you might have, say, a single individual who is out with friends, they're having a lot to drink. The friends say, let's order another round. And she thinks to herself, oh, I really feel like I've had too much to drink, but everyone else seems to be enjoying and having fun and wanting to drink more. So I should just go along. I shouldn't state my opinion that I've had too much to drink. And of course, this is a familiar phenomena. I think lots of us have had experiences like this before. The pluralistic ignorance part here is that we might imagine that, in fact, everyone is having that thought. So that is, it might not just be the one member of the friends group that feels like they should stop, but everyone feels like they should stop. But everyone thinks that everyone else thinks otherwise. And so as a result, continues to drink. And so you have this kind of very odd pathology where everyone is engaging in a behavior that no one wants to engage in, but that they continue to do because they think everyone else wants to continue to engage in it. So it's a sort of strange kind of situation where you have the perpetuation of an unpopular behavior, or potentially a behavior which no one wants, but nonetheless is continued. There are lots of examples of pluralistic ignorance, and it's been discussed substantially in the literature. The classic examples, like the one I just presented, I take to be examples of what I'm calling preference-based pluralistic ignorance. So where the underlying thing that we're interested in is something about like a private preference. Do I want to drink more? Do I not want to drink more? It's not just about college kids drinking. It's about lots of other things. So sanitation habits are really critical, and thinking about how people engage in various types of sanitation practices, child rearing practices. Of important relation to the theme of this conference, perpetuation of discrimination. So one of the earliest cases of pluralistic ignorance was a case where a sociologists looked at attitudes towards discrimination, in particular segregation in the American South, and found that a lot of people privately thought discrimination was wrong, but were unwilling to say so because they thought they were amongst a minority. And that was perpetuated because nobody was saying that segregation was wrong. Sexual practices, in particular, sexual promiscuity has been another one that's been investigated substantially, where people think that they ought to engage in more sexual practices because other people are. These I take to be all examples of preference-based, because the thing that is ultimately at base here is a question of, do I or do others like engaging in a particular behavior? But there's also a type of pluralistic ignorance, which I'm calling epistemic, which I mentioned already. And this is where the thing that we're pluralistically ignorant about is something like a belief about something external to our group. So for example, there's an interesting study that looked at climate change beliefs and found that in certain communities, privately, most people believed in human-caused climate change, but didn't speak out about it because they thought they were in the minority. And so as a result, you actually had a belief that was widely shared in the community, but that was believed to be not widely shared in the community because of a pluralistic ignorance phenomena. Similarly, there's been studies about in corporations about response to poor performance that seem to look like this too. That no one wants to bring up that the corporation is doing poorly, despite the fact that everyone believes that the corporation is doing poorly. Christina Bicchieri talks about how the phenomena of breastfeeding, or in particular failure to breastfeed young infants, might be an example of this kind of pluralistic ignorance, where in certain communities, women believe that breast milk is unsafe to give to their children, and so instead give them water. And finally, a phenomenon that's been discussed a lot in academic circles is imposter syndrome. And here, again, I think we have a case of kind of pluralistic ignorance, where it's, each person thinks, oh, this is a case where this is very difficult material for me, but I don't think it's difficult material for other people. But then everybody comes to believe that. So this is what I want to talk about. I want to focus on the epistemic dimension, but I do want to say I don't think that this is a clear cleavage of pluralistic ignorance. That is, I don't think that any case of pluralistic ignorance is going to be obviously one or the other. In fact, I think most cases involve both preference and epistemic things and they're interrelated, but I'm going to focus exclusively on the epistemic side with the idea that it may be representative or maybe transferable to things that sort of live in the middle. I do want to spend a moment distinguishing pluralistic ignorance from a couple of other observationally similar phenomena, but that I think that it's important intellectually for us to keep them apart. The first is there's a phenomena in economics called information cascades, or a broader phenomena known as social learning. The idea here is that if I privately come to some particular belief, like I think, oh, it's prospects for a quick end to the pandemic are high, and then I come to speak with a number of you about this topic, and each of you tell me independently that the prospects for the quick end of the pandemic are quite low. I might change my belief as a result of talking to you because you're smart people. You've also investigated this topic. You have informed opinions as well. This is not a case of pluralistic ignorance because what's critical here is I've changed my belief in light of what you've told me. So it's not that I privately continue to believe that the pandemic will come to a quick end and I just shut up about it because I think that you believe differently, but rather I've fundamentally changed my belief. I think that that is not a case of pluralistic ignorance. That's a case of social learning. And so while sometimes in the literature you'll see social learning equated with information cascades, I actually think that it's important that we keep these distinct, precisely because in the case of social learning, there's no ignorance there. There's no sense of conformity. The second thing is that's important to distinguish it from is that there needs to be a kind of, again, the word ignorance is important here. You can have cases where a true minority of people keep quiet because they correctly recognize that they are in the minority. So you might imagine a community, say, where a majority of people believe in climate change, a small minority do not believe in climate change, but nonetheless, they keep their mouth shut because they believe that they're in the minority. This is a case that's not really pluralistic ignorance because, again, the belief is correct. They correctly believe that they are in the minority and are quiet because they desire to conform. So while it's similar in some respects, I think it's also importantly different because it's an example of in a certain sense, not ignorance, but true belief. And then the last example, there's not a great name for this. I'm calling it asymmetric loss, which is after a terminology that's used in statistics. The idea here is that a group might keep quiet about something, not because they're under any misapprehensions about what other people believe, but just because there's no reason to bring it up. So an example I often give is in a group of friends, we might all hate Julie's husband because we find him to be a bore. None of us may say that out loud, especially in Julie's presence, not because we think that we're in the minority or because we think that other people believe differently, but just because what good is it to tell somebody that their husband is unpleasant? So there's a case where we all keep quiet and we don't state our beliefs, but not because of any pluralistic ignorance, but just because we're being polite or because there's no particular reason to say what we believe in that context. And again, I think that this is important because it's again a case where there isn't ignorance. There's no pluralistic ignorance. So with that on the table, let me give a kind of rough definition of what epistemic pluralistic ignorance is. There's some subtleties here, and we can certainly talk about whether we might want to add a few conditions or slightly reword them, but I think this will do for our purposes. The critical thing here is that most people believe P, that most people who believe P say not P, and those people do that because they think one is false. So that is, most people who believe P think that they are in the minority, even though they are not. So this I take to be the sort of critical three features of epistemic pluralistic ignorance. That is, if you don't have all three, you have one of these alternative phenomena, which are nonetheless interesting and well worth studying, but just not what I'm talking about today. When it comes to looking at pluralistic ignorance, I think that there are kind of two broad research questions that one can ask about it as a phenomena as a whole. The first question is the classic sort of game theoretic stability question. That is, why is pluralistic ignorance an equilibrium? Why does it persist? So if a society finds itself in a state of pluralistic ignorance, why does it continue to stay in that state of pluralistic ignorance? A second question that one might ask here is, in this context, in the context of pluralistic ignorance, is how could that situation emerge? That is, how could a society that doesn't initially inhabit a state of pluralistic ignorance come to at a later time exhibit pluralistic ignorance? And I actually think that's the more important question and what I'm going to spend most of my time on. But first, let's talk about the stability question, because that'll allow us to develop a concrete model of pluralistic ignorance, which is what I'm going to do in today's talk. The first thing I'm going to do is rely on a model of the individual that works as follows. Individuals are modeled as having a private belief that is a probability, right? So we're treating the individuals as having a private conjecture, a credence in the proposition that we're interested in. And that credence can be anything from 0 to 1. We actually are not going to make many assumptions about where this thing comes from or how it changes. So we don't really need to make a lot of Bayesian assumptions or anything like that, but we're going to assume that it's a single number and that it's a number that can range between 0 and 1. The second thing we're going to assume is that agents make public declarations, and those public declarations are not probabilities, but are instead qualitative beliefs. So they say whether they think P is true or whether they think P is false. So that's a constraint about the ways that they communicate with one another, but one that I think is reasonable, given that mostly that's how we communicate with one another. I will occasionally communicate my probabilities to my friends over beers, but I think that that's largely because I'm a bizarre person. Most people tend to communicate in qualitative belief. So the question is going to be for us, how does an individual go from their private subjective belief about the probability of the proposition to this public declaration, this qualitative declaration? And for this purpose, we're going to adapt a model originally developed by Aidan Mohseni and Cole Williams, both PhD students at University of California, Irvine, that tries to model conformity effects. So the idea here is that I'm going to maximize this expected utility, maximize my expected utility, and my expected utility is sort of broken into two parts. The first part here, highlighted in blue, is the truth-oriented part of the probability. That is, I'm going to try and make the announcement that I think is most likely to be true, but the degree to which I care about that is weighted by this term alpha, which Mohseni and Williams call truth sensitivity. That is, how much do I care about the truth of my announcement? The part highlighted here in green is my social sensitivity. That is how much do I want my announcement to conform to others? And so here, I want to make the announcement that is consistent with the majority of what other people are saying. So that term there, the new P or new not P term, is the proportion of my friends who are also announcing P, or the proportion of my friends who are also announcing not P. So at the two extremes, where alpha is equal to 1, I just say the thing I think is going to be true, and that's the end of it. At the other extreme, where alpha is equal to 0, I just say the thing that I think will be popular, and I don't care about what's true. And for alphas that live in between 0 and 1, I balance my desire for truth against my desire to conform with my friends. Okay, so we're going to represent our agents as choosing their announcements by maximizing this utility function that has this single parameter, or well, really two parameters. There's their private probabilistic belief, which is P, and then there's their truth sensitivity, which is this term alpha. Now, one thing that that Mohseni and Williams highlight, they're not talking about pluralistic ignorance in their paper. I'm adapting their utility function for that purpose, but they do point out that basically what's going on here is that in a certain sense, our agents are playing a kind of coordination game with one another. That is, the conformity part, the part highlighted here in green, makes them just want to do the same thing as other people. And this is what coordination games are. So as a result, the Mohseni and Williams utility function already explains the answer to that first question. That is, why is pluralistic ignorance stable? Well, if people's desire to conform is sufficiently high, or if they're said in a different way, if their desire to make the true announcement is sufficiently low, and everyone else is making an announcement that runs counter to their private belief, they will also make that announcement that runs contrary to their belief. That runs contrary to their belief. So as a result, it is an equilibrium in the Mohseni-Williams model that people engage in pluralistic ignorance. So that is, if everyone else is saying drinking is good for you, then even if I don't believe that drinking is good for you, I will nonetheless say it as well, so long as my truth sensitivity is sufficiently low. So that answers the stability question, and I think that that's the right answer. And this isn't a new answer by any stretch of the imagination. This is the same answer that you'll find in Bicchieri or in any of a large number of other social analyses of pluralistic ignorance. It's stable because it's an equilibrium, and it's an equilibrium because people have, in one way or another, a desire to conform, either because they're afraid of being punished or because they just have a raw desire to conform. So that's the answer to that first question. I don't think that this is news. So for those of you that know pluralistic ignorance well, this will just be totally familiar to you. The part that I want to focus on now is the question of emergence. That is, how can pluralistic ignorance come about in a society that is initially not pluralistically ignorant? And there are two mechanisms that have been broadly proposed in the literature. The first is a kind of contagion mechanism. So the idea is that you might imagine that you have a society where a small group of true believers can cause a contagion that eventually leads to pluralistic ignorance. So in the context of something like climate change, you might imagine you have a society that initially believes in climate change. You have a small group of people who disbelieve it, but in some way or another, that small group is able to convert the entire community via some kind of pluralistic ignorance mechanism. And there is more and less detailed versions of this story. There are some models that try and develop it. There are also some just informal conjectures. I'm going to use the Mohseni-Williams model to see whether or not this is plausible, or under the conditions under which this is plausible. There are other models in the literature. Because of the constrained time, I'm not going to talk about them, but if in questions you'd like to know about the differences between my model and others, I'd be happy to talk about them. I'm going to look at a particular network here. A particular kind of social network. The social network that I'm going to look at is called a scale-free network. The reason that I'm looking at this network in particular is because it represents kind of extreme inequality in social position. So in scale-free networks, you have a small number of people who have lots of social connections, while most people have very few social connections. And so it represents a kind of nice starting point to look at the influence of unequal social connections in a society. The degree to which these are representative of real societies is debated, something which for my purposes I don't care that much about right now, but nonetheless I'd also be happy to talk about that if you're interested in the question period. So in order to investigate the contagion hypothesis, what we're going to begin with is initially randomly distribute beliefs amongst people in the community, and then allow the process to evolve. So people make a declaration, then they see what their neighbors declare, they then make a new declaration, and then that process continues iteratively until eventually the network reaches stability. That is, everyone is happy with their current declaration in light of what their friends are declaring. And we're going to manipulate the average belief, that is the average probability of that underlying community. So that's on these graphs, that's what's on the x-axis here. So the x-axis represents the probability, that's the average belief of the people in the community, right? So down here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, down at the bottom, you can, down at the bottom here, this is the average belief of the community is very low. And at the top, the average belief is very high. The y-axis is a representative of proportion, but it represents different things depending on what we're interpreting. So let me tell you what each of these different dots represent. The red triangles represents after the process has stabilized, what proportion of the community is announcing true. So you can see that when we start out with most people having very extreme belief, that is a very low belief, at the end of the process, a very small number of people are announcing true, which means we're not getting anything like pluralistic ignorance in that context, because what we're seeing is ultimately the same belief. The blue dots represent how many people are announcing the opposite of what they believe. So that is how many people are either believe false but are announcing true, or believe true but are announcing false. And you see that that number can get relatively high right in the middle here. you can see that you can end up with almost half the population announcing the opposite of what they believe, but never more than half, right, in this model. The last thing here is this line right at the bottom, and it's important that it's basically 0. That is the proportions of runs of the simulation that resulted in where a majority believed one thing, the majority was announcing the opposite. And you'll notice that basically that line is at 0. It's probably very hard to see on your screen, but there's a little tiny blip right in the middle where very, very rarely, but not never, do we get pluralistic ignorance. The point that I want to make from this graph is that pluralistic ignorance is very difficult to bring about in this model. That is, when we just randomly distribute beliefs, it turns out that while we can get a reasonably large fraction of people to say the opposite of what they believe, it never rises to the level of proper pluralistic ignorance as we've defined it. So it is actually quite rare. What you're instead getting is small clusters of people who believe in the proposition, who then say false, and a small cluster of people who disbelieve that say true. And so you're getting some numbers of them, but in the end, it's not actually a substantial fraction, or it doesn't lead to pluralistic ignorance. The second graph on the screen just shows what you might already expect, that if people care more about the truth and less about what other people are saying, then this phenomena is even less common. So that's what the graph on the right-hand side is. Now, this was assuming that we distributed beliefs at random, but we might not want to distribute beliefs at random. We might imagine that the beliefs are distributed in a way that correlates with the structure of the social network. So for instance, it might be the case that people in the center who are very, very highly connected are disproportionately likely to have a particular type of belief. So what we're going to do here for our purposes is we're going to assume that the people in the center are more likely to believe the proposition. They will have a higher credence in the proposition than on average. So there's a correlation between social network location and the belief. Now, the graph on the left is the one that I just showed you. Nothing's changed. It's exactly the same. The graph on the right is what happens when we do a particularly extreme version of that we make sure that the people who are in the center always have the highest belief. That is, they are most certain of the truth of the proposition. And now you can see we can start getting some pluralistic ignorance. So in particular, look at the blue line, not the dots, but the line. You can see there that especially when the average belief is very close to 50%, so when we're in that sort of 30% to 50% range, now pluralistic ignorance is actually quite likely, almost to the extreme of being certain. So, so what happens in this context is the very central people are very confident. So they initially announce the proposition is true. Because they are socially central, they influence a lot of other people to then announce true. And especially if those people were already sort of on the fence, they didn't think it was true, but they're not super confident, then they're easily swayed by the people in the center. So then they announce true, and then that contagion spreads, and we end up in a state of pluralistic ignorance. So from the contagion perspective, what we can say is that contagion is indeed possible, but it requires a correlation between social influence, that is sort of centrality in the social network, and belief. So while the contagion hypothesis is certainly alive and well, it's not as though we should expect pluralistic ignorance to arise in any social network or any setting where people have differing beliefs, but rather it really does require this relatively special setting. That is that there's a correlation between what you believe and how central you are. A second mechanism, so this is a totally different mechanism now, for pluralistic ignorance that people have discussed is the idea that pluralistic ignorance might arise in contexts where there is underlying belief change. So that is where there is some outside pressure, not inside the community, but some outside pressure causing people's beliefs to change over time. In order to model that, we're just going to imagine that everyone starts by believing, say, the proposition is true with some incredibly high probability, say 0.099. And over time, their belief sort of slowly degrades towards 0. Just with each passing time, they come to believe the proposition less and less. This could model any kind of outside force, but in particular, you might imagine this as scientific consensus. So that is, we might initially believe that 100 years ago or 200 years ago that it's impossible for humans to alter the climate because the climate is so massive and humans are so small. As scientific evidence mounts, we might come to change our belief, that is, to believe in climate change, and that might slowly shift beliefs over time. And now we might ask, well, what happens in our model if we allow beliefs to shift over time? And so here's an example of just a single of 3 separate runs, but single runs of the simulation to illustrate what happens. So initially, of course, everyone believes that the proposition is true, and everyone announces that the proposition is true. And there's no pluralistic ignorance. Everybody believes it, and everybody is being honest about it. So there's nothing sort of interesting that happens there. But as time moves on, that's our x-axis here. As time moves on, people's beliefs slowly degrade. So they get lower and lower and lower. The critical point is at that 50, time index 50. That's where now all of a sudden our beliefs cross that 50% threshold. So now we all believe that the proposition is no longer true, but we've inhabited a culture where everyone has said that the proposition is true. And so as a result, we continue to say that the proposition is true because that's what our neighbors say. And so even though our private beliefs have changed, our public statements do not. The blue line there represents a community where our alpha parameter, that is how much we care about truth sensitivity, is distributed at random in the social network. So this is a scale-free social network again, but we just sort of randomly decide who cares about social connection, who cares about what their friends are saying and who doesn't. And you can see that once we cross that 50% mark, eventually the beliefs start to degrade. Fewer and fewer and fewer people say true, even though no one believes it. But it takes a while. So this society is exhibiting pluralistic ignorance for some time until their belief sort of sufficiently degrades that they're so confident that overwhelms their social sensitivity. Although you can see on the graph, there are some holdouts, some small bits of the community that just refuse to change no matter what. And indeed, that's correct. I mean, the model predicts that. The other 2 lines, the red and the green line, represent situations where we decide somebody's truth sensitivity based on their social location. So the red line is a case where people who are central care more about the truth than people who are not central. And there you see the pluralistic ignorance disappears very rapidly because the people at the center, as soon as they change their mind, are happy to say it because they care about truth to a great degree, and pluralistic ignorance evaporates. The green line is the opposite. That's a case where the people in the center are very conformity driven, and it's only the people on the periphery that care about truth. And you see there the opposite phenomena. Pluralistic ignorance is even worse and persists for a longer time frame, which is sort of consistent with what you might think. We can do a more systematic analysis of that. That's what these graphs represent. The x-axis here represents the average truth sensitivity of the community. The y-axis represents how much time is spent in pluralistic ignorance, weighted by how many people are in there. And then the 3 different panels indicate the different ways of associating the truth sensitivity to social location. I don't actually think there's anything new in this graph that wasn't already present in the example that I just gave you. So if interpreting this graph doesn't feel like much fun to you, don't bother. I think anything that you got from the previous slide is what you get from here. This is just to show that this isn't an idiosyncrasy of the example that I chose, but is rather a systematic phenomena about this relationship. Okay, so getting a little close on time here, so let me just kind of wrap up. The overall conclusions, remember the questions that we started with. The first question was, why is pluralistic ignorance stable? And we offered what is, I think, the standard party line on why it's stable. It's stable because it represents an equilibrium among people who have a desire to conform. Whether that desire comes from a fear of punishment or just an outright desire to conform, we don't really need to venture into. But so long as they have any desire to conform, once a society finds itself in the state of pluralistic ignorance, we expect it to stay there. The more difficult and thorny question was the question of emergence. That is, how is it that a society can come to occupy a state of pluralistic ignorance when it initially does not occupy a state of pluralistic ignorance? And here the answer is somewhat more complicated. That is, the contagion hypothesis, that is the first one, the first hypothesis, that it might be that a small group of true believers could convert a society to believing in, to being in a state of pluralistic ignorance, is possible, certainly, but it does require a relatively special set of circumstances. That is, it needs to be the case that the society itself is already somewhat on the fence about the proposition, so their beliefs need to be relatively close to the 50% mark. So it can't be that we're trying to convince people that the sky is red or that up is down, but rather that we're having to convince them of something which they're somewhat uncertain about to begin with. And secondly, that it needs to be the case that there is a correlation between people's beliefs and their social location. So it can't just be that the group of true believers is sort of randomly distributed through the population, but rather the group of true believers needs to be systematically related to the social position. The true believers need to also be socially influential. If that's not the case, we would not expect contagion to lead to pluralistic ignorance. Exogenous belief change is far more likely to lead to pluralistic ignorance. So that is, it's almost guaranteed that for at least some time, a society that starts out believing something, but then comes to disbelieve it privately, will inhabit for at least some time period a sort of transitory position of pluralistic ignorance. And so as a result, I think that if we find a state of pluralistic ignorance, or if we're looking to go figure out whether pluralistic ignorance exists, we should probably try and focus on cases where there has been some exogenous belief change, which I think is characteristic of things like climate change, for instance, or child rearing practices, or things like that, where there has been an overall social shift in response to evidence that might then lead that society to exhibit a case of pluralistic ignorance. And even in the belief change setting, it's still important, or at least the amount of pluralistic ignorance, or the lifetime of pluralistic ignorance, does depend on the relationship between individuals' preferences for conformity and their social network location. So if people who are more central are more sensitive to the truth, they are you will still find pluralistic ignorance, but it will not last as long as it will if the reverse holds. That is, if people who are more central are more conforming. I don't know, as a matter of social psychology, which of these two things hold, whether people who are more socially central are more conforming or more truth sensitive. My guess would be that they're more conforming, but this is outside of my expertise, so I won't push for that. But in any case, that suggests that exogenous belief change, in either case, it suggests that exogenous belief change is, I think, probably the more likely cause of pluralistic ignorance, rather than something like the contagion of from true believers. And I think that this is important because it helps us to understand the degree to which pluralistic ignorance might arise, both in terms of where we can look for it, but also if we're worried that it might arise, what we can do to prevent it. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you listening.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. And the floor is open for questions. And please use the chat function, so that's the easiest way for me to see your questions. Yeah, Manfred.
Yes, hello. It's very interesting. I have two points that might be of interest. So there's one classical situation, and I think this is known. It describes the situation and the stabilizing effect. This is Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes, which is just classical, how beliefs are stabilized.
Yeah.
Something maybe more interesting, in the discussion in Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, there was this dominant polling institute run by Elisabeth Nülle-Neumann, who wrote this book, Die Schweigespirale, the Silencing Spiral, which was hugely influential. So her main claim was that the switch from conservative politics in Germany in the 60s to the first social democratic government was because of journalists deviated from the mainstream conservative opinion. And the author herself was very conservative. She was very critical about that. And so made the public vote for Social Democrats because they thought that most other people are voting for Social Democrats. So this was a situation just as you described. Now Agression, you presented two opposing views or two views, but they can be of course mixed, because one could think about the central influential group changing a belief slowly and then being at an avant-garde for the change in the whole population. This might be, and this is completely value neutral, something like the role of intellectuals, the role of the Leninist party or whatever. So there were these ideas. So well, I was wondering about whether you see this too as the picture that you painted as two extremes, but one should actually look at a combined picture.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I agree entirely. I think in reality, of course, lots of situations might involve something like both. So there might be some people who change their belief. Maybe they're more socially central, as you suggest, like the avant-garde, who's looked up to, or maybe they're not. Maybe it's the central sort of remain true believers while the population at large changes their beliefs or something like that. I mean, I'm biased, but I think that maybe that's something that you find happening in U.S. politics right now. That sort of there's the broad scope has sort of changed away from certain more conservative ideals, but the people who are sort of central and have control of the news maybe haven't. But so I think that definitely they're not incompatible by any stretch of the imagination. I wanted to kind of isolate them so that they could be analyzed independently. But in reality, of course, I think that both are going on. One important thing that's being left out of both models that also is, I think, somewhat connected to this sort of change is that new people join and new people leave, right? So, people die and people are born, or people immigrate and emigrate, and, these sorts of things. And so that's another phenomena too that might be relevant. That is sort of like belief change in a certain sense. So if the younger generation has a different opinion than the older generation, that looks a little bit like what I'm modeling as belief change, even though it's not really people changing their beliefs, but rather the population sort of changing its beliefs by people being replaced. So yeah, I agree entirely. I think both phenomena probably are involved. And it would be interesting to expand the model to include both phenomena and maybe see, you could imagine sort of saying, well, maybe they're synergistic. And actually, it wouldn't surprise me if there aren't situations where putting them together actually makes pluralistic ignorance even more likely to come about because of some kind of synergy of the two different mechanisms that I described. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So David is the next one.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. It's a really nice area, nice talk. I guess I have two questions. So first, in the literature on epistemic update, there are a number of factors that are not in the model, probably quite reasonably, but one that you could model is if you get the same information from multiple sources, that can have something other than an additive effect on your belief update, and presumably it could have something other than an additive effect on your chances of reproducing the message. Though I don't actually know of mathematical studies of that, but you could look at some of the social psychological studies in those terms. I don't think that people have provided the sort of calculation that you would need to form a model. People also look in that literature at reliability, so some level of history of people agreeing with you or you agreeing with them affects, again, your belief. It's normally done in terms of your belief update, but again, that could be decoupled from how likely you are to repeat. So you might conceivably repeat something that you take to be reliable more than you would repeat something you take to be unreliable, or for that matter, vice versa, independently of your own beliefs. So at least these are factors. The other thing is, you touched just now on changes in the network, but I think you didn't, I think that you didn't, and in your talk, when you talked about the network structure, you didn't, well, I think you didn't talk about this in a way that suggested the large role it might play, but also the ease of modeling it. So your networks in these models are, as I understand it, static.
Right.
But and furthermore, they're on or off connections, right?
Right.
But it seems very reasonable that the way people's network changes will be according to how aligned what people say is either with what they believe or what they say. Yeah. And this would not be hard to model. You could easily reduce connections when people disagree and increase connections when people agree. And I think it would be easier to model this if you had a probabilistic version of the network where for any pair of individuals, there's a certain probability of interacting, a distance type model. So for example, just taking the networks you had, there's a certain probability of receiving communication from someone 2 nodes away. You could think of that as someone saying, Trump says X, even though you're not connected to Trump. Right? But then you could further think of, based on the level of agreement or disagreement, those weights changing, so the distance changing. And that would be quite easy to model. And I think it would have a fairly dramatic effect, because what you said, what you postulated as just kind of a chance happening, it might happen that this core of connected individuals is somewhat aligned, is of course not at all unlikely and not a matter of chance. People join a church or whatever it is actively. In fact, they're recruited into it, right? And form networks. So it strikes me that this would be like I like keeping models simple, but it strikes me that this would not be a difficult factor to examine, at least to see whether it would produce the conditions that you see in the model you have now, even if looking at the full range.
David, can you come to the end, because we have 4 more questions waiting. Okay.
I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I think all of those comments are really good. And let me just say a couple of quick thoughts on all of them. The first, the concern that you raised, which is absolutely right, is that I've treated social influences as if it's additive. So one additional person saying something, saying that the proposition is true or false, is exactly the same amount, regardless of however many people say it. It would not be hard at all to adapt the Most-Any-Williams utility function to make that some other kind of function of the social network. So I definitely agree with that. I don't know that it would make a huge difference to the model, but that's a conjecture. I haven't looked at it, and I definitely think it would be worth looking at, because I think there's some reason to suspect in the empirical side that there is something very different about, say, unanimous disagreement with me as compared to 90%. That is, people are much more willing to say what they believe in the context where they aren't the only person. That is something really critical about that. The variation in reliability in social relationships, I think that's also definitely relevant. I might care about different people to different degrees. I might want to agree with certain people more than others. And that's pertained to your other comment about the sort of unweighted social network, that is, that I'm either connected or not, and I either care or not about them. And I definitely agree. I think it would be interesting to look at that phenomena as well. The last comment I totally agree with, the issue that the social network may evolve and change according to people's beliefs. And in fact, I have what you almost just described, a model that I'm working on now for a different chapter of my book that looks at questions about polarization. And so what happens is, when I can alter my social network in a certain sense, trying to maximize this Mohseni-Williams utility function, I now have two levers. I can either change what I say, or I can change who I talk to, right? And so I don't have to stop saying that climate change is true. I just have to stop talking to the climate deniers. And I think that I'm trying to model each of those phenomena separately, because I think that they are conceptually separate. However, your point, which is totally correct, is that in real society, both things are happening at the same time. I think actually it would make pluralistic ignorance even harder to bring about, precisely because now I have the option of continuing to say the true thing and just talking to different people. And so I think it's important, but my conjecture is if I were to add it to this model, it would make pluralistic ignorance even more difficult, precisely because I could continue to be true or say the thing I believe, and just find new friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is by Sanford Goldberg.
My question was closely related to one of David's, so I'm happy to skip.
Okay, thank you. Then is Jose Luis.
Yeah, I just had a couple of minor observations, one of which is that the phenomenon you call pluralistic ignorance, I mean, you and others seem to present it as a negative thing, but presumably it can also be highly pro-social.
Yeah.
So tax paying, not picking up litter, all sorts of things are underwritten by pluralistic ignorance.
Yeah, no, this is a really good point, and something that I say in the written version of this, but I don't. I just skipped for time. But you're absolutely right that cooperation in all sorts of public goods problems, social dilemmas may well be an example of pluralistic ignorance. Like, I don't want to do this, but everybody else says that I should, so I'm going to do it. Some people have suggested that things like social change that makes use of what sometimes gets called political correctness is also an example of pluralistic ignorance. That is, I'm not going to change your attitudes about what you think about the other, another race or something like that. But if I can get you to shut up about it, then I can get it to be the case that maybe everyone thinks that everyone else isn't racist, even though they really are, right? And that's a case of pluralistic ignorance, but it's a quite good one. It's one that we're actively trying to achieve. And so I agree. To think that pluralistic ignorance is always bad, it's oftentimes the tone. I think some of that has to do with, like for Christina Bicchieri, for instance, she's really interested in, a lot of her work is about how do we get rid of bad social norms. And so there she's sort of focusing on the bad cases, but you're totally right. Pluralistic ignorance can be, from a social perspective, quite good.
I have another question, but there were two others, so I'll come back after those two.
Thanks, Jose.
Okay, then Christoph Heinz is the next one.
Yes, so I would like to distinguish a strong psychological hypothesis about conformity and a weak psychological hypothesis about conformity. So the strong would be that, the strong hypothesis would be that people are expressing something that they do not believe because they believe that others believe it. And it seemed to me that your models was assuming this strong hypothesis. And I would like to contrast it with a weak hypothesis where people are not expressing something that they do not believe, but they are shutting up because of pluralistic ignorance. They are shutting up because they think others will think they are wrong. And so I think that the weak conformity hypothesis is much more plausible than the strong conformity hypothesis. And so my question is, don't you think that your model could work as well with a weak hypothesis?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because in fact, this is like in the study that I mentioned of climate change. That's actually what they find. It's not that the community, the people who believe in climate change, go around spouting, conspiracy theories or whatever disagreement with climate change. But what they do is they studiously avoid ever talking about climate change so that they're not forced to make this choice between lying or conforming. I think that my model can actually be interpreted either way. So there really are just two behaviors, either speaking about something or not speaking about it. or, you know, I call it P or not P, but it can be lots of different things. But I do think, I do think that there is, it would be interesting to introduce that as a genuine third option, because in reality, that's like with climate change, that is what happens. You can actively try and tell people about how much you believe in climate change. You can actively try and tell people how much you disbelieve in it, or the middle ground where you sort of say like, well, I'm going to avoid talking about it, or I'm going to say that I withhold judgment, or say something, I've just lost the word, but, you know, say something equivocating about it, where you don't say what you really believe or something like that. And I think it would be relatively easy to adapt the model for that purpose. And it's one of the things that I've thought about sort of on my to-do list of next things to talk about, because I agree with you. I think it's really a good direction to go, because in reality, that may be what's going on. People really try and avoid it. But yeah, so thank you. I agree with you entirely. I think it's the right direction to go.
Okay, so the next question is by Edgar.
So I just have a small comment. Did you think about the role of a crowd, like a big gathering of people in this type of spreading? Because many interesting things happen there. So one of them is that many people are very close to each other, so you get a very strong communication. So the network is kind of dense at that point. Mm-hmm. Another thing that happens, and that's very well known from a lot of historical examples, is that you don't want to be a minority at a rally, right? You don't want to say something other. So alpha is getting super high or super low, depending on how it's defined, if you're there. And because basically they would kill you maybe if you say something wrong in such a context, right? And then the third one is that if you have a big crowd, it's going to be televised, and so everybody sees that. So then basically it happens that you have a higher chance of acting conformly even if you don't believe it, and then also a lot of people see that. So I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I treat that alpha parameter as if it's sort of, you know, stable and the same across all circumstances and over time and everything like that. But you're absolutely right that in different social circumstances, my pressure to conform is going to be very different. One thing that you said is like being in a crowd is a big deal. And I think that actually relates to one of David's comments, which is that the social influence may be nonlinear. Right. So if it's everyone, that's very different than if it's just if I'm at a rally, absolutely everyone disagrees with me. And so that's far more influential than if I'm even in a community where I'm in the minority, but I at least have compatriots. But the other point that you're making is that there also are higher and lower stakes opportunities for me to state my beliefs. And so that might alter that alpha parameter. So for instance, you're right. If I'm you know, being asked to state my opinion on TV, I might be much less willing to state what I think to be a very unpopular opinion than I might at the dinner table. And it might even be not just the size of the audience, it might be this other features of the stakes. So I also am maybe going to be more careful when I'm testifying in a court of law, even if I'm only talking to 20 people, than I would be on a Zoom call where I'm talking to 20 people, because you folks can't send me to jail if I say something false, right? Whereas maybe I could if I was in a court of law. So I agree with you. I think that it's an idealizing assumption to treat that alpha parameter as if it's like a personality type, as opposed to something that might alter with respect to stakes. And I think you're also right that this could have an important influence on on pluralistic ignorance, precisely because it might, if I find you to have stated two different opinions or something like that, that might give me insight into the fact that, oh, well, wait, he said one thing on TV and said something else privately. And so, you know, it could definitely influence the phenomena, but it's just not something I've modeled. But I agree with you. I think it's worth being careful about that assumption, because it's probably not really totally accurate.
Okay, so Jose has another question.
Yeah, so looking at the other end of the spectrum from this pro-social, there's a phenomenon that seems to entail pluralistic ignorance, but seems to be qualitatively different and stronger. I'm thinking about sort of collective insanity cases, like when you find hundreds of thousands of Hutus thinking it's a good idea to hack to death an entire ethnic group with machetes. And it seems to me that this is more than, obviously, I don't know, obviously, maybe it just seems to me to be more than something that's going to be explained by an exogenous belief change in a few influences, right? So and this is slightly unfair to throw this one at you, but I'm kind of curious to see whether you had any thoughts about how to deal with this, or whether the model can be extended, or whether it's just a completely different phenomenon. You don't want to...
No, I think that there's a way that the model can be extended to account for this, but you have to add in in a certain sense. I think that what's going on in these sorts of cases is that you have also a kind of unequal social influence. That is, it's not symmetric. So here's an example, right? If there's a community of people who believe P and who are capable of punishing me for saying not P, and then there's a different community of people who believe not P, but they can't punish me for disagreeing with them. Well, now that alpha parameter that I've treated as sort of the same regardless of my belief and regardless of my declaration, that's not really right, because if I go against the statement of the powerful, maybe I go to jail. And if I go against the statement of the non-powerful, maybe I don't get invited to dinners anymore, right? And so I might, that will alter sort of where that boundary is, where I shift from saying one thing to saying another thing. And so if you end up with a correlation between those who are in a position of power or capable of exerting punishment and their beliefs, now I think you can also generate pluralistic ignorance in that context. So that's not something that, I mean, that requires a little further alteration of the model, but I think that it's a nearby model. It's sort of within it's articulable in the language of the model, which is to say that that alpha parameter will change. There is a case where I think that it starts to live on the boundary of what I was calling the asymmetric loss case, which is at the extreme, at its extreme position. If imagine that I live in in North Korea in a dictatorial regime. Well, even if I know that absolutely everybody except for a small handful of powerful people know that the regime is illegitimate, there's no gain from me saying anything, because what do I gain? There's nothing that I can get out of it. And so I think that's where we start to live on the boundary between like the sort of, I don't know, pure pluralistic ignorance that I've been describing, and at the other extreme, that kind of pure asymmetric loss. That was like the case where we don't tell our friend that her husband is obnoxious, because what do we stand to gain? And so I think that even though they're very impactful, they represent some kind of hybrid of those two kinds of phenomena, where people get into positions of power and then create a system of incentives that not just create circumstances for pluralistic ignorance, but also just create circumstances where even if I know everyone else agrees with me, I just don't have an incentive to say so. I don't know if you agree, but then.
Can I make a micro follow-up? Because I think this.
We have time for one more question. We have one more person asking, so I would like to give it to the last question. So Alessandra Tanesini.
Hi, Kevin. So maybe it's sort of a bit tangential, but I'm interested to sort of see what you think about this. So it seems to me that there is a real difference between the preference cases and the epistemic cases. Because, and I think this links to something that David Beaver was saying, right? So the fact that everybody around you seems to believe that P gives you some reasons to believe that P yourself, right? And so, whilst the fact that other people prefer that P is not clear to me that in the same way gives you a preference for P, right? So there seems to be some things that are independent in the preference case, they are dependent in the epistemic case. So with the climate change, right, case, so you could think that people really believe there is climate change, but say that there isn't because of desire to conform. But you could also believe that there are a lot of people there who says that P because a lot of people around them says that P, and that gives them sort of higher order evidence that P, right? And so I was wondering whether you have, I know it complicates the model, but whether there is a way of pulling these two things apart, because in different cases, they could be the driving force, and that would make a difference if once we've got the stable pattern, if we want to interfere with it and create a disequilibrium, what we do might depend on which of the two things are more forceful in that specific case.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I agree entirely. That's part of the reason why I wanted to separate them, because I agree with you. It's, you know, if we're talking about some, you know, outside of us proposition that's, you know, about climate change or about something like that, the mere fact that you disagree with me provides me at least some evidence. I mean, it depends. Maybe I think I know more than you, but, you know, just sort of in ordinary cases, it provides us it provides me some evidence. In my model, I've prevented our agents from reforming their opinions in light of the opinions of others, because I did want to sort of create this pure pluralistic ignorance case. But actually a point, I'm forgetting the name, somebody else has said this, it's not my point, but somebody else points out that in the case that you describe, that actually makes pluralistic ignorance harder. Because now if I'm in the case where, if I'm in a setting of pluralistic ignorance, then I mistakenly think that other people believe P. That causes me to start to believe P. And so actually what starts out as pluralistic ignorance just becomes outright false collective belief, right? So we move from this case where initially there's pluralistic ignorance, but it actually shows how unstable pluralistic ignorance is, because not only could it collapse in the sort of traditional sense where we discover that we all disbelieve what we're saying, but it could also go in the other direction where we come to believe what we're all saying. And so, so that's a respect in which epistemic pluralistic ignorance is this kind of bizarre phenomena, that it sort of can collapse in two different directions, and you have to kind of walk a knife edge to prevent it from going in those two different directions. And I talk a little in the written version of this, I talk a little bit about that, not in much detail, but just a little bit. But I think that that's a really good point. Oh no, there was something else I was going to say. Oh yes, so the question about the relationship between the two types. It is somewhat complicated, because I think that some of these cases, it's actually a little ambiguous. Like, take, for example, child rearing practices. There is some element of preference to these, like, well, I think that, you know, children should, I don't want to breastfeed my child, or I don't want, you know, or I think I should punish my child using corporal punishment or something like that. But on the other hand, there is, when, at least my understanding, at least, and this is mostly from Christina Bicchieri, that in a lot of these cases, there are also empirical beliefs that go along with that. So it's also, no, this is the only way to prevent my child from misbehaving, or or breast milk is unhealthy for the child. And so there's this kind of relationship between the preferences. Sometimes they're built on top of beliefs, maybe, or maybe not. And so that's part of the reason why I think there are some cases where there is a kind of interrelationship between them. And if you add in other kinds of epistemic pathologies like motivated reasoning, it might be that my preference drives my belief as much as my belief drives my preference. And so I definitely agree with you. They're distinct, and it's important to talk about them being distinct. And I do actually think that a lot of what I've shown, and this last point that you brought up, which I agree with, shows that epistemic pluralistic ignorance is in a certain sense harder to come by than maybe the preference-based pluralistic ignorance. And so even though people have sort of talked about these as a single type, and maybe they're all very common, I think that maybe actually the epistemic cases may be rarer, and that cases of pluralistic ignorance might involve preferences in one way or another, precisely because it seems like those are easier to sustain. So I feel like I'm still missing something from your question. I'm sorry if
maybe you can continue the discussion in the break, because we are already well over time. So
I'm sorry.
So many questions. So thank you again, the speaker, for this interesting talk. And so we have a short break, and see you again in, I don't know, 5 minutes or so.
Can I get my screen sharing sorted out?
Yes. Yes.
Please.
Just 1 moment.